Good morning, Intenders.
Good morning.
Welcome back and welcome to Morning Intentions. Today is Monday, April 6th. We hope you had a lovely, wonderful weekend. I did. Annette, I'm assuming you did as well.
Oh, I did.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you did. And we're off and running, continuing on with codependency. We're still doing our book study with Terry Cole's book, Too Much. But this month, rather than focusing on the ins and outs of what is high-functioning codependency, we're looking at what does recovery from that habit look like.
Today, we're going to talk about the shadow self, and that might sound like a little bit of a downer, but it's actually very, I want to say enlightening in a way.
The shadow is enlightening.
The shadow self is enlightening because we don't know until we know, but when we know, we can do something about it. And that's what makes this exciting. That's the word I'm looking for. I think focusing on the shadow self will be exciting. At least I think it's exciting. Hopefully everyone will think it's exciting.
If there's one thing we're passionate about, it's our personal development work and all that it entails, including talking about our shadow selves. I'll give us a brief overview then, Annette. I know you have a few things to say. We're starting off on page 150, that's 150, where we learn that the shadow self was coined by Carl Jung, one of our favorites around here. Seems that he has come up a lot over the past few months. And the shadow self represents the parts of ourselves that we've repressed or denied. Ugh. Who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, I know. It kind of starts out like, who wants to talk about this?
This is exciting. This is going to be great. The shadow self. Well, these are the things that we don't like about ourselves that we don't even want to admit are part of us. So we repress them, we deny them, and we say, oh, that's not who we want to be. So we're going to stuff those back into the closet, throw a bunch of clothes on top of them, and hope they never show up. Unfortunately, what Carl Jung talks about is that we have our unconscious mind as well as our conscious mind. And even though, yes, we think our thoughts and they're conscious, yeah, and we think that's where we do most of our thinking, it's actually the unconscious mind that's driving the car. We act more from our unconscious mind than we do our conscious mind, so it becomes necessary to look at our shadow self, because if it's driving the car and we want to take control, we can't ignore that anymore. We have to say, let's be brave and put on our brave hats here and look at what we might not want to admit about ourselves.
We've talked about this on the podcast years ago, not recently, but the best way to really look at your shadow self is to do some archetype work. If you are a client of ours and you want to do some archetype work, let us know, because that's some of our favorite work to do. Because that is where we see the shadow self, but then also we recognize our light. It's very similar to the Enneagram, but it's a little different in that it's a little bit more tangible, I think. With the archetypes, we can see it playing out in other people, and we can start to notice these archetypal patterns that show up in life. And so if you want to go deeper in this, we might even want to do this in the podcast in a few months or so. The shadow work through archetype work is fun, and I'm going to use that word again. It's pretty enlightening.
It is, and it takes so much of the power away.
It stops being so scary.
Exactly. What I found is when we did our archetype work just on our personal development journeys, you and I, it took a lot of the power away from the shadow self. Once I put words to it and was able to put words to it and say, oh, this is what's going on, then it became not the big monster in the closet. It just became something that I could look at and say, oh, that's maybe not what I want to do, but the more I look at it and shine that light of love on it, the less power I give it.
And I think maybe starting with the fact that we all have shadow and light. We all have shadow and light. There's no one that is pure light unless there's some divine being. But if you're here walking the earth, you have shadow and you have light. When it's unconscious and you don't understand your shadow, that's where you just keep doing the same old things and things may not work out the way you hope. Once you understand, oh, this is what happens and this is how I show up when I'm coming from my shadow self, then learning to come from your light is pretty easy, because when you, as to use a phrase that you used, Ada, is like shining the light of love on our shadows will heal them. And that's why it's exciting work. If you're following along in the book, turning the page, one more page over to 152, there's the title of Defense Mechanisms. What she explains, I'll read, but then I want to talk about this a little bit. So she says, just as we disavow our shadow selves, like we don't want to look at them, pile clothes on them, put them in the closet, like Ada says, we use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from feeling discomfort, guilt, and anxiety. These feelings can arise if we feel threatened or internally conflicted. The mind is unconsciously wired to shield us against anything that inspires discomfort or pain. So it finds ways to twist the reality of what is. While we see the good intentions here to protect us, defense mechanisms can distance us from our true emotions and what I think is so important is our real true self. It is important to note that for the most part, we resort to defense mechanisms unconsciously. Still, if they go completely unexamined, they can block our ability to create healthy relationships with robust boundaries. This week, we're going to focus on these defense mechanisms, coping strategies that we use. And then we're going to go on to some helps with mindfulness. And then she's going to move on to boundaries. So that's kind of our roadmap of where we're going. But it's hard to create healthy boundaries when we're coming from our shadow self. The good news is that we can become aware of how our unconscious mind has been protecting us from stressful feelings and situations. That awareness can create the possibility for mindful choices. So she's going to teach us about these defense mechanisms that we use when we're coming from our shadow self. And then she says the best antidote is to use some mindfulness practices. And then from there on, once we have the light and we know how we show up from our shadow self, we can say, that's not serving me anymore. We can use our mindfulness practices to let those habitual behaviors go, and then we can set some healthy boundaries. So that's how this is going to play out in her book and how it's played out in my life too. I had to, and we all have to, see our shadows. The biggest stumbling block that I've noticed as a coach that I have experienced, even this morning on my Easter walk with Ada, I experienced this. I fight tooth and nail when I am facing another shadow, like I'm right now. This is no coincidence that we're doing this today. My healing journey has kind of looked like I work through things and then things kind of settle down. And then I work through things and then things kind of settle down. Well, I'm facing a shadow right now. And this will be really helpful for me. I don't know if I'm willing to share what my shadow is. Maybe I'll put on my brave hat and share tomorrow. But I know that I've got to face this shadow. And I know that it's a defense mechanism. And I know that I'll stay stuck if I don't work through it with this methodology that Terry Cole is teaching in her book.
One final thought I have before we say goodbye for today. I want us all to approach this work that we're doing, as we always say, with a sense of love and compassion. We all say stupid stuff. We all do stupid stuff. As Annette said, everyone has a shadow self. Everybody on the planet has a shadow self. The challenge gets to be when we have our shadow self pop up, We can either look at it with love and compassion, or we can use one of our defense mechanisms so we don't think about it and don't really look at it. We will always go, in my opinion, to a defense mechanism if we don't have a sense of love and compassion about ourselves. So that's what I want us all to bring with our work this week, today, and every day, because the more love and compassion we can have, the less we'll need to go into our defense mechanisms. And then that's the only way we can actually do our work on this personal development journey. Love and compassion all the way, each and every day. And let's have that be our intention for today. Please bring love and compassion into your shadow work. And let's personalize that. I will bring love and compassion into my shadow work this week. Thank you all for joining us today and every day. Our day is better because you are part of our day. See you tomorrow.
See you then.